So tonight, 1 in 3 of you will struggle with sleep, and most of you will try to fix it with something from the pharmacy aisle. But what if I told you some of the popular sleep aids you grab over the counter actually could be working exactly against what sleep is about? So my guest today is Dr. Stasha Gominak, a Harvard-trained neurologist, 20 years and thousands of sleep studies deep into one question: why did the world stop sleeping? And with her most recent interview hitting almost 5 million views in the last couple weeks, I think it's going to be an interesting sit down between her and me as a pharmacist. And we're going to go in some places maybe that other podcasts haven't gone with her. I want to start with people listening right now who've done everything quote unquote right. 8 hours in bed of sleep, no caffeine, afternoon, sleep hygiene, even maybe doing the newest CPAP machine, but they still wake up exhausted every morning. You looked at thousands of sleep stories. What actually is failing in their nights?
What's failing is the chemistry that the brain uses to accomplish falling asleep and moving through the phases of sleep has failed. My patients and I discovered that our move indoors has left us with vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D deficiency is not really about bones, and it's not really a vitamin, and it has a major effect on the microbiome. That means it links our move indoors and lack of sun exposure to losing some of the bacterial species that we absolutely need, because those bacteria secrete chemicals that we absorb and they help us sleep. So that turns out to be a domino effect that ends up showing up mostly as acetylcholine deficiency, which is a neurotransmitter that is pivotal for sleep.
What I'm hearing you say is this maybe isn't so much of a mattress problem or a willpower problem. It's more of a chemistry problem. But I want to ask you this. So if we build out our night from scratch, so you got light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, what exactly is each phase doing? What's reparative? What's restorative? What is going on there in a normal night of sleep?
Good question. And the real answer is we don't really know. But I'm going to trace out what I think is best supported by the little that we do know. There are a couple of phases of light sleep, and then we drop into what's called slow wave sleep by the sleep experts. Slow wave sleep on your tracker is called deep sleep. Growth hormone is only released in children during slow wave sleep. Also, in adults, growth hormone is also linked to slow wave sleep, but it's secreted in a pulsatile way instead of continuously. So obviously we're not growing once we finish adolescence. But that kind of suggests that if adults are still having growth hormone coming out at the same phase, perhaps that's related to repairing the physical body the way growth happens, using this similar set of tools that we did when we're growing, but we repair to stay the same size. Now, the next part is you always go between deep sleep, where you're really vulnerable because you're not conscious, and light sleep. And we break it into blocks during the night. And in between deep sleep, we do light sleep. And you can kind of think about that as my level of consciousness raises. I can hear, I can feel, I don't open my eyes. I'm still asleep, but I am kind of checking my surroundings to make sure I'm safe and nobody's trying to eat me. And then we go back down into another block of deep sleep. And you have to picture all this through the lens of every single animal out there does this. That means those animals are finding a safe place, but they can be eaten by someone else because they're so vulnerable. The second set of deep sleep is called rapid eye movement sleep, and that's because the eyes move back and forth at a certain rate. That is the phase that most of my patients were lacking when I did their sleep studies. And there was no possible way to connect that finding to not being able to breathe. So sleep apnea was king. This was 20 years ago. We were told to look for it in elderly males. We were not told to look for it in young females who just had a couple of kids. And I happened to do a whole bunch of sleep studies in young, healthy females with headaches. And they were all missing this phase of sleep. And importantly, the other two complaints they would frequently have is, I'm in a bad mood and I can't remember anything. And we know that what happens in REM is linked to making chemicals that help our mood and putting recent events into long-term memory.
So I heard a couple key things there. One of these was you said there's an interplay of a number of chemicals that play a key role in each stages of these, and your body cycles throughout those throughout the night. So the other thing that I also heard is this slow wave sleep, which includes both deep sleep and REM sleep, they have their own unique, what we think are certain characteristics that play in the body. So what I want to know is one thing is, so before you started all this work, you mentioned the word tracker. There was no way to even look at this stuff unless you went in for these fancy sleep studies and put electrodes on your head and do all that. So half the people nowadays are wearing either like a watch or a ring, and the scores on these REM and deep sleeps are getting, you'll see these every single morning. Do you think these tracking devices have changed your work? Do they help? Do they hurt? What is your thought on those?
So my original view was, I think that physical pain is very much related to whether or not you can get paralyzed correctly during sleep. And this part is not fully accepted by the sleep community, but it looks to me like our muscles get paralyzed from the neck down while we are in slow wave sleep. And slow wave sleep is usually done in the first half of the night, REM sleep more in the last half of the night. But in both of those, we get paralyzed. In REM sleep, we get fully paralyzed, including our face, our airway that we breathe through. And if you think about that, it's really risky. So paralysis in the extremities, if we couldn't get paralyzed correctly, I think that could be linked to pain syndromes, especially things that are there when you wake up and then get better, okay? So when we went into the tracker phase, one, I had no idea how to put that within my thinking. I had no idea if they were trustworthy, but I thought, it would be pretty simple to put a little gyroscope in that ring or that, so I bet what they're doing. And the problem is most of them are not publishing the algorithms they're using to say this is deep or this is slow wave. They're using that same name. And this is REM sleep. They're just showing you something. They aren't medical industry, so they don't have to show proof online. I only really care if people are getting paralyzed because I thought that was equivalent, okay? And the other thing that they're doing is they're measuring heart rate. Now, I thought that the trackers were probably pretty good because they're probably using a gyroscope. And then here's what happened. About a year ago, I reviewed all the pediatric literature about what we know about children and sleep. And we don't know much. And that's important because so many of our kids are not sleeping normally. And the next part was, because children are frequently being videoed, nowadays we have videos and you have a video monitoring in your kid's room. So they did a lot of sleep studies in kids, and they had a video monitoring, and they had the top of the line tracker on their leg or their head or their arm. And the kid's sitting up in bed, and the tracker says that they're asleep and not moving, and assuming not moving. So I have lost confidence in the trackers. Now, what is the piece that I think they can probably do pretty cleanly? They can probably do heart rate and heart rate variability pretty cleanly, okay? So the thing I tell my clients is, don't look at those scores they give you, because I think those are made up. But heart rate variability is something that they probably shouldn't be able to screw up. That just means how long between each beat of the heart. Now, having said that, there's still some value, because if we're using a single tracker and we don't change the tracker and it's in the same person, if you do something in your sleep, if you have a big steak at 9 p.m., or you have a big bowl of ice cream at 9 p.m., and then for 2 weeks you don't. And then you start doing RightSleep, or you take a sleeping medicine, or you add some supplement that we didn't even know had any power of sleep. And all of a sudden, not only do you feel like you sleep better, but your tracker then records a bunch of REM sleep. And you've been tracking and you have a baseline. So it's not that they don't have value. It's that you have to realize that it's really about you and what you've recorded as a baseline, and then keep an open mind. If there's no match, like if somebody says, I know I looked at the clock at 1 o'clock and went to the bathroom and they show me in the middle of REM, then you should be suspicious.
Gotcha. So let me ask you this with your program, and we'll get deeper into the stuff you recommend. There's a neurotransmitter, I swear, that my customers ask about 10 times a day regarding sleep, and that's GABA. That's the calming one.
Yeah.
The one that sleep gummies claim to boost and all that kind of stuff. Where does GABA actually sit in your brainstem sleep model? And is acetylcholine the real whole story that people are missing?
No, it's not the whole story. Acetylcholine is just one of many neurotransmitters, and GABA is another one. And the cannabinoids are modifiers of neurotransmitters. And obviously you, Steve, and I are big into the biochemistry. We want to look at, I don't really know where GABA sits within this, except to say that the benzodiazepines are supposedly affecting GABA. And also to say, I don't think acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter that gets goofed up. And I think it just happens to be the most commonly goofed up one. And that's really important. Now, what really happens once you do RightSleep is very much focusing on what your body says when we do certain things. We add certain vitamins, but also when you finish the chemical part, it doesn't actually mean that your sleep can be perfect. And if your sleep falls off again, then you use these vitamins that I am sure about, but then there turn out to be other deficiency states in the background, like iron or sulfur. And I don't have an answer for GABA for what you've asked for, but my suspicion is that once you, for instance, I made a reference to adding iron and what happened. One of my clients that was using very high doses of B5, like every 4 hours, like 5,000 milligrams of B5, way too high, but she would have to use it every 4 hours. Her internist added iron. She said, look, you've been, iron deficient since the baby was born. Let's add that. And all of a sudden, she had to come way down. Like in a day, she had to come down from 5,000 to 500. And then she had to go from 500 to 50. And she is really smart. She's got amazing spreadsheets. Her husband is an engineer. She's really smart. She's an architect. That suggests that there's a place where iron is playing this role here. Thiamine is also playing a role in acetylcholine. That means when you see clinical responses, what you and I are interested in, and the public is not as much, they just want to get better, is how can you trace back where that is having a role? And we could talk about that. But ultimately, GABA, I don't know where it stands, but it's still important. I think acetylcholine is famous now because I happened to fall in to a chemical mix that brought it back. So when you see somebody get better, that's when you go, oh my God, that must mean that this is deficient. And there will be certain patients that they'll only, for instance, there are certain people who only do well with benzodiazepine. And of all the other kinds, we have really made that into the devil. And it's not. It's just duplicating something. So it would be my guess that some of the people that only respond to one of those, and many people are very susceptible to one and not another. Like one works and another one doesn't. So I bet you that that'll have to do with GABA levels. I just haven't clarified it well enough to answer that.
No, that's a great thing because I will tell you, like you said, I'm kind of a biochemistry nerd like yourself. If you look at like glutamate to GABA conversion, it requires active B6. And, you can't make actually GABA if you're actually B6 deficient. And so that's exactly why I asked that, just curiosity-wise, as an acetylcholine. Yeah, so just looking at those type things, because you're right. You mentioned earlier that little chemicals play such a unique role in ups and downs in all these parts of sleep. And so you're right. We don't really know what goes on, but we just know they play a role, like you mentioned. So tell me, you mentioned earlier about how REM sleep, it's like the true paralysis of our sleep cycles in the sense that we're actually paralyzed from head down. Tell me a little more about acetylcholine and that's role with that.
One of the confusing parts of this is that once somebody sent me an article about 8 years ago that told me about the acetylcholine anti-inflammatory pathway, okay? And I'm going to refer to that first so you can see why this becomes confusing. The idea that you become paralyzed in REM sleep then links back to what they see on these sleep studies. And in the supervised sleep study, they're watching for apneic episodes, which means this is too paralyzed, but they also report these leg movements that are called periodic limb movements of sleep. But they really don't have electrodes all over your whole body, even though it feels that way, okay? That means you could have arm movements, you can have butt movements. They're not going to pick those up. They're not, they don't have 20 different places that they're looking. Now, what that implies is, well, wait, I had an 8-year-old that just came back and he had apneic episodes. So he didn't have severe apnea, but he stopped breathing and he had leg movements. Why should he have any of those? It was just, well, wait, maybe if these cells that paralyze us have to be perfectly paralyzed. And the way you accomplish that in neurology is a certain firing rate. It's a cell that's supposed to send a message to this muscle can't move, and you do it at a very specific rate. If it starts to wobble, so it goes whoop, 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 then you're not right. And then if it goes whoop, 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 then you're too paralyzed or not paralyzed enough. And both of those then would be coming from the same place. And that place is something I'm reading weird, geeky articles about, where some guy has got a needle inside this nucleus in a rat and they're dropping neurotransmitters on it and watching the rate go. And I think he is watching what I'm thinking. And I can't even believe he's published it. Like, who would want to read this stupid thing, right? This is so obscure. But thinking of it that way then had me really looking at the complaints of my patients from the point of view as this is a paralysis problem or this is a clock problem, because there are other parts of the brainstem that put our clock in the right place. And that circadian rhythm stuff is what became famous. And light through the eye goes to the pineal, makes all these chemicals that run the clock, putting your sleep in the right place. But the transitions between have an awful lot to do with firing rates as well. So in the background, then I started to think of it in a different way. So when I fell into vitamin D that had receptors all over this paralysis switch, I just went, oh my God, this is too much. This is too coincidental. And then, oddly, there is a coincidence that is somebody takes Walter Stumpf's article about vitamin D receptors are in this nucleus reticularis, pontus, oralis, caudalis that nobody knows about. And he writes that all these nuclei have vitamin D receptors. And then another scientist writes about what does D do when it hits that, publishes that. That's in the early 80s. And I happen to be standing next to her at a vitamin D workshop. And she tells me this, and I went, oh my God, this is amazing. So then it helps the puzzle pieces fit together, and it directs your attention at acetylcholine. The other weird thing that I really had no answer for was how come ADHD became epidemic over the last 40 years in the same time frame as sleep apnea and insomnia? Well, acetylcholine is used for alertness, that's used to sleep. And it has two separate nuclei that do that. And firing rates turn out to be important there too. So all the clinical observations, except for a few one like this GABA question, those pieces, what I'm hoping is you and I and everybody else who's interested in biochemistry will fit in the other pieces like the B6 part. And by accident, because I remembered you should give all Bs as an 8-pack, I had backed up with all the same doses. And the other thing that's lucky is the generic multivitamins have a set of doses that I haven't really gotten to the bottom of, but they're probably close to what we need. And then B50 existed on the shelf already. I used B100 by accident, and it worked like a miracle in a day. When you got the dose right, it was like, ooh. And that probably means that the ratios of thiamine to B6 to B5 that the bugs make are close to that.
Gotcha. No, that's a great call out. We're about to take a deep dive into vitamins, but I want to ask you one last thing, because I've been waiting to get you on my podcast to ask you this. So in America, the best-selling over-the-counter products for sleep, that's like ZQuil, Tylenol PM, Advil PM, Unisom, they all have diphenhydramine. That's that old school antihistamine you and I learned about, Benadryl, in it. It blocks histamine. We know that makes you sleepy, but it's also a super strong anticholinergic. So what I've been wanting to know, looking at acetylcholine and all, if your research is right, our favorite sleep aids actually block the exact chemical we need to get our REM sleep in. Is that something you've thought about? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I not only think about it, but I have these people who have taken my course and we hang out together once a month. And I have all these other biochemistry geeks like you who come to this and we hang out and we talk about things that we just got in the mail or, we send articles back and forth. one of my ex-clients, who is a really intelligent guy and has had lots of experience treating himself, got into the histamine articles. And histamine has at least 5 receptors. I'm going to probably find some more later. And we not only use diphenhydramine, but we use these other antihistamines for reflux. It's a different category, but ultimately he got into the literature that shows that depending on the histamine receptor, it modifies acetylcholine levels. That means those two are intertwined. And there's a reason why diphenhydramine probably makes you fall asleep, but it doesn't help you stay asleep. If you have that 3 a.m. problem, it's a really good for the beginning, but the anticholinergic effects, if they last into the morning, that's why you feel so stupid. So the people who don't like Benadryl are the ones that actually, they need that acetylcholine and you're blocking it, okay? And histamine is very complicated. It turns out that a couple of my clients have tried all sorts of things, and then loratadine, which is supposedly non-drowsy, helps them sleep. So the reason why I got to this idea that there are neurotransmitter ratios, that there's a specific chemical footprint, and I've used a symphony as an analogy so that you can say, oh, there are all these players and they have all these instruments. So the neurons are the players, the instruments are these chemicals that they're using, and then there's a conductor. It's because when you do RightSleep and you get the acetylcholine back, there are other things that are happening too. There are other chemicals that are going up and down. And really what you have to do is, as time goes by, experiment a little bit. And what we found is a Klonopin lover, this is a story I tell all the time, who's on 3 milligrams of Klonopin, which is a huge dose of Klonopin. It's a benzodiazepine. It's said to be long-acting. She's been on it for years. We neurologists know if they stop it or run out, they can have a seizure. So pharmacists are like all over this, you know. She comes in after being on what became RightSleep, and this is what I'm offering to people now, but these are the experiences that led to that. She comes in and says, no, I'm off my Klonopin. I'm like, oh my God, what happened? Okay, did you have a seizure? And she's an elderly woman, and she says, no, I got up one morning and my grandkids told me I was staggering around like a drunk. And she said, and I remembered, and I didn't think she was going to remember all this blah, blah, blah that I did. I remember you told me that when I didn't need Klonopin anymore, my brain would tell me it was time to come on. And I went, wow, I expected that, but and then she said, I went down to 1/2, I still felt like a drunk, and then I stopped it. Nothing bad happened. That means you view these sleeping pills as either one, successfully duplicating something that the brain needs and it doesn't have. That means it's not bad or good. It depends on the setting. And what I was thinking, which we've all been stuck in this genetic mindset for 40 years, was she's a Klonopin lover. That's her genetics. The next one is a Klonopin hater. That's their genetics. No. It can move when you move the biochemistry. And that's really what you do with supplements. You are changing what the cell has at its disposal to make repairs and get it closer to being able to do its job.
Gotcha. No, I love that analogy, and I see that all the time in working with patients about trying to get those key vitamins and nutrients at a place so the body can do what it's supposed to do. That's what it is, and we have so many things that distract us from it, from diets to stress to everything else, and that's good. Because one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, and now I'll probably get myself in trouble with some traditional trained clinicians, but I'll just say it. In working with patients, I see things like vitamin D, I know, is made from cholesterol. When your body hits it from the skin, that's a skin derivative. And I've actually read some studies that maybe things like statins potentially have the risk in lowering cholesterol could lower your vitamin D levels, potentially. I know metformin depletes B12. I know like PPIs deplete your B12 and your magnesium. So as prescribers in this and as a pharmacist, how much of this deficiency epidemic do you think we've actually caused?
There are 2 ways to look at that. One, I just found an article that supports the idea that when the acetylcholine level isn't right, that the liver starts to make more cholesterol. That's really interesting. The first way to think about this is, and I'll give you a long answer, but I think it's important to understand that medicine is doing the best they can. They don't intend anybody harm. Yes, it's true that they've been seduced by the pharmacology and the drug companies. And I lived throughout that entire time and seen the FDA and seen drug approval change over that time. But the first picture is you and I are two physicians standing next to the bed of this guy who just had a heart attack. And we think he's about to die. And it's 1945, and we don't have catheters. We don't have jack. We have a blood pressure cuff. We can take his urine and we can put our finger in it and say, oh, it's sweet. He must have diabetes. And, we have very little left. And what we both are thinking is, if we could figure out how this happened before it happened, and we have pathology. So we see this plaque stuff, this cholesterol-filled inflammatory stuff inside the blood vessel. If we could figure out how to prevent that from happening, then we could get this before the guy dies. And we put together, the cholesterol is elevated, and there are cholesterol plaques in this atherosclerosis, and the sugars in the urine, so the sugar in the blood is too high, and his blood pressure measurement is high. And then we have just spent the last 40 years making hundreds of medicines, and we actually have people who have heart attacks with a cholesterol of 180. They're on all the medicines we can picture. Their sugar that was elevated is now normal on medicine, and their blood pressure is on medicine. Like, they're on 5 medicines, and all 3 of those things we identify as risk factors have been controlled. And then the guy has a heart attack, and then shouldn't he be able to sue me because he says, look, I've been taking those 5 pills for 5 years. Weren't you supposed to have an outcome that prevented this? And I and his family both say, what do you expect? You've got hypertension, diabetes, and high cholesterol. This is circular logic. We have lost sight of why we were controlling those measurements and forgotten to say, wait, we've controlled them, but the problem hasn't gone away. In fact, I have a new heart hospital next to the old hospital. What could be underlying this? So I don't want to blame medicine for doing what it's supposed to do, which is to try to prevent stuff. Unfortunately, what I will blame them for is saying, if you have a normal diet, you don't need vitamins, because that started to come into play in the 80s. I've been unable to find the origin of that comment, but I think in the early 80s, they were probably right, because at that time, everybody was still pretty much outdoors enough that they probably didn't have a profoundly screwed up microbiome. So you start to see all these epidemic things starting up in the 80s when there's a convergence of several things that brings us indoors. And it's now observing that, looking back, that you can say, oh, this wasn't toxins. Maybe the toxins are playing a role, but it's not just that and the antibiotics. This is linked to the biochemical pathways. It's not something I could have actually put together in any way in 2004 when I started the sleep stuff, because the GI literature had not gotten to the place where it will tell me what each bacteria is making, and the fact that it goes and it hits the inside of the GI tract and it sends this message. Those advances have all come in parallel, so I don't want to take credit for something that's no. All the literature has come at the same time, and I look at the literature and go, I knew that was what was happening, but there was no proof. Okay.
No, I hear you 100%. I've got a mentor the same way. We were doing some things many years ago before the literature proves it. Now you can go look stuff up, or new things are done. Like you mentioned the things with the rats earlier, like, oh my gosh, I knew that was something, is looking at that. I think people have kind of figured out at this point in this podcast, we're going to talk about some vitamins and supplements now, because what I hear you saying is if we give the body the right things, it can produce these chemicals that were needed to get proper sleep. So starting out with vitamin D, I'm a 60 to 80 guy too. You can go back years and look at my social media. So that's been my numbers all along, and I hear that. And so I've been pushing that exact range because that's when I see the best patient stories at my pharmacy. But obviously you've arrived with that with your sleep studies and this and the work that you've done in that 1680. But tell me, what happens to somebody in, let's say, 65 at a vitamin D level of that versus somebody who's got a vitamin D level of 30? What's the difference there?
Well, one of the most important parts of that is there are genetic underlying disease tendencies. So the thing that's a little confusing for most people is we've said that a vitamin will have vitamin deficiency symptoms, as though it's simple and one variable will produce X. And that is absolutely wrong. There is never one variable in any biologic organism. There are always many. So having said that, some people manifest, and let me say one other thing. I think sleep is one of the best physical symptoms to follow. It's not the only one, and it's not, having disordered sleep is not there for everyone who has low D. That means you have to have sort of an open mind, and you have to say the majority of people do X, okay? It's true that vitamin D became famous for bones, and that was because it was extremely hard to be objective and give a good description of rickets. Rickets was described as D deficiency as the first name applied to it, and that was infants and toddlers who do not sleep, they don't eat, they cry all the time, they are a colicky baby. That is still what it's called. That was described 200 years ago, well described in articles starting in the early 1920s, and sun exposure and exposure to bulbs that emanated UVB light would cure those kids. That has not been dragged into present day, even though dentists and doctors see colicky babies and they say colicky, that is, I'm sorry, it's a nightmare to have a kid who is not sleeping. The entire household falls apart. That means that these ideas were there in the background. Then, because that is a kind of difficult, because kids get infections and, their brother might have hit him in the nose and we don't know if he fell down. And okay, then they actually had an objective sign, which was an X-ray machine that showed in end stage rickets, the legs get curved. And then the textbooks started to use that as the proof, and they used that then as a study method to say, okay, we're going to follow the bone development in a rat and look for the chemical that we think is deficient here. Unfortunately, they don't look at the rat babies and see if they're, when they're deficient, are they cranky? They're not thinking that way. So when you ask, what are the symptoms of a D of 30, you may not have any symptoms. A person may be completely normal. Also, you have to keep in mind that it was really designed to go up and down during the seasons. That is the existence of this chemical. That is this chemical's job. It's an endocrine hormone that talks to all the other endocrine parts, sex hormones, thyroid, cortisol. It is the part that links what we do with all of those hormonal cycles to what the seasons are, so that you can get through a period of time when there's no food. Now, that's not active in, the Honduras because there's no snow there. And that meant that people who lived near the equator actually had ways to keep their D from going over 80. Normally, they weren't supplementing. They were just out in the sun. But it also means that somebody who's living in the far north, who has snow on the ground for 4 months, can lower their metabolic rate. They can sleep. They basically hibernate. And humans used to do that too. Now, having said that, it means that we were designed to have a D of 30 occasionally. And if you happen to be living in London when it was full of coal smoke and there wasn't any penetration of UV light, then you start to see epidemics of Parkinson's disease. They start forming under certain circumstances. So it's not like this is the first time that we've had bad teeth, lots of cavities, dying soon. Dickens has a whole series of books that are about non-healing ulcers in the legs. People who are really poor, all their teeth fall out. Mm-hmm. It is not just about nutrition. It is also about this pivotal player. So having said that, you could be completely asymptomatic with a D of 30, but let's just say your D goes to 40. I'm going to do this in several examples. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Your D goes to 40. You're 32 years old. You want to have a baby. And at the end of the summer, your D is now 45 because you've been out in the sun and you get pregnant. Your D is 45. You have a pregnancy during the first half, you do fine. You don't have a lot of vomiting in the first trimester. Second trimester, you look okay. And then by the end of the second trimester, you're starting to have swollen legs and your back hurts and you can't sleep. It turns out all of those are vitamin D deficiency related. And I know that because I've taken women through the pregnancy and you watch their levels and you get their levels back up a little bit and they all go away immediately. That means if the baby is sucking up your vitamin D, then the set of symptoms has to do with your pregnancy and that sort of thing. The second piece is it depends on how old you are and how long your D has been 30. That means we can't really assess the level of deficiency by that blood test. That blood test is a snapshot of what is happening right this moment, and it is really the leftovers. It is not the stuff that's in the cells. If you really understand that D is active all over the body, doing all sorts of things, and you have been deprived of vitamin D for 10 years, let's say. You were a lifeguard when you were 18, and then you got a real job, and now you're 35, okay? That level of D in a 17-year-old in March, before they go out and be a lifeguard, has a really different significance than later when you're 35, and it's actually August, and your level's 30 because you work all the time. If you have 20 years of deficiency, when I give you a dose of D, your deficiency state is such that the D gets sucked into all the cells. And if you take 10,000, your level may go from 30 to 32 because that's the leftovers. That is not the way the publications are portraying this. So there's another concept, which is, what if I'm going up on my dose and measuring my levels over time, and I get to a level of 60? What am I supposed to do then? Am I supposed to stay on the dose that took me from 40 to 60? No, because then you'll go up to 80 and then you'll feel awful, okay? That means you have to find the dose that keeps you the same over a span of time. And most people need a little bit more in the winter than they do in the summer. And over the 10 years I'm doing this, everybody's need, the dose they take every day to keep their level the same, slowly falls over a period of 10 years until they need relatively little. Like most of my patients were taking 5,000 in the summer, 10,000 in the winter. Once we got good at it, we've been doing it a few years. Now I'm taking like 4,000 in the winter and maybe 2,000 in the summer, okay? So the way of manipulating supplementation with hormones, it's very difficult, and it is not a vitamin. And also I would mention that our whole set of concepts about vitamins and blood levels, none of the blood levels are really the whole answer, not even the B12 blood level. None of these Bs, the blood level does not tell you what the brain, the part that I'm interested in are those cells in the brainstem that run sleep.
Sure.
That means I can tell whether or not this dose of this vitamin made it better or worse. The blood level doesn't change.
No, I love what you're talking about there. And that goes for all hormones because I do a lot of hormone replacement for women. And honestly, yeah, what matters what hormones are in the blood? It's what's in the cellular level. As you mentioned, vitamin D, it's a prohormone. The fact that it turns on cellular transcription, that's how it works. That's what it does. And it's very much a challenge. So you said a couple key things, and I'd agree. Everybody always asks, what's my right vitamin D dose? And I'm like, you've got to test. You can't guess this stuff. And so I love what you said there. One of the things that's a controversial thing I'd like to know your thoughts are, vitamin D, if you're supplementing morning or night.
It depends on the person. When I used to supplement at night, I would get revved up. And now I can use it if I wake up. If my D level is a little off, so one of my complaints at the beginning was I wake up at 3 a.m. and I can't go back to sleep and I'm awake for 2 hours. That's the most common complaint for young, healthy women. And if I took D, I would be more revved up. Now, if my D is a little off and I think it's low, I can take 1,000 at 3 a.m. and I go right back to sleep, but I'm only doing that if I'd had 2 nights before where I struggled for 2 hours. And then I have to go, okay, I need to go get a level drawn and see what's going on. So you really do, even with D, you have to do it based on what succeeds for the person. And your biochemistry will change over time. You mentioned that D goes in, all the hormones go in and express proteins. That is a really important piece, because what I saw happen, and that's why I have a website and a workbook, is as you give D changes every cell's request for the raw materials. That means your need for B's and A and E and all the other things that your bugs you're making will actually increase as the D level increases. That's a pivotal part of why I have a program that you have to follow, because after we did D for 2 years, we were doing better, and then we all fell off a cliff and we're doing terribly. And we have a whole bunch of pain of various kinds. Our sleep is bad again. And it turns out I've pushed them into a B vitamin deficiency state. And that made no sense to me, because we're told that all the B's come from the food, and there been no dietary change. And it was not in a setting of malnutrition. That's where the microbiome piece comes. Oh, they have so many of them have IBS. Could it be that the guys writing about these vitamins, they're hinting that they come from the poop? Like each one of them, thiamine has a colonic bacteria source and a food source. They're hinting, but they won't just come out and say, no, they were wrong about it coming from the food. The food goes to the bacteria, and then the bacteria feeds us. That idea is already coming out of the GI literature. So jumping the vitamin literature that says, oh, it all comes from food, and saying, no, that was wrong from the beginning, and these people have the wrong microbiome, and then why would they have that in the same time that they have this D deficiency? Maybe D is a cofactor to the growth of bacteria, and that's where those pieces start to come together. It never made any sense to me to say, well, once I get the bacteria back, then the only reason why I was interested in that was I can't handle 8 chemicals and the dosing. It's overwhelming just to do D. So I have no idea what the right dose should be. If you get the bugs back, I believe they're the only ones on the planet. When they come together as a foursome, they know exactly what to provide you. And that's always the way it's been. 250 million years, it's been that way. So once I get the microbiome back, you should be fine and you should stay fine. Well, it didn't work. Over time, you needed more and more Bs, because it turns out then when you're sleeping well, your brain is saying, hey, I love this. I'm able to make all these repairs. And what we really want from sleep is to turn back the clock or prevent Alzheimer's. That means there is a second piece, which is you have to be willing to say, okay, my body may need more of these raw materials until it gets finished with all the repairs, and then I taper off of them, and my body will tell me when that should happen.
Well, you've covered so many things today, from the D's, the vitamin B, the testing, and this sleep thing is rather complicated. And you're right, if you're on a journey on your own and you can't figure that out, I think that's something like your program. Tell me, if people want to learn more about you and what you do in your program, where can they find more information about you, Stasha?
I have a website that's Dr Gominak, no period, drgominak.com. That has lots of information, or you can join and become a RightSleep member. And I also have a YouTube channel with lots of different videos, interviews like this, also things called sleep chats, which are single short videos, 5 minutes or longer, about what does sleep have to do with carpal tunnel syndrome? What does sleep have to do with plantar fasciitis? What does sleep have to do with, so if somebody has a diagnosis and they want to go into the questions about that. And I would say what I recommend for most people is that they go and look at some of the interviews and look at and see whether or not it resonates for them, and then go and become a member. This is a pretty complex journey, but it is well worth it.